There we are. Good morning, everyone. How nice to see you all, even though you can't speak to me. This will be the last week, I think, we'll have daffodils. We'll have something more spring-like next week. This will be the last session before Judy succumbs to the knife. So I'll keep you posted about how things progress. And Judy's got some nice stuff to talk to you about, and I apologize if any of the illustrations offended anybody's sensibilities. You didn't see the stuff that I didn't use. It was quite phenomenal. You know, Andrew's got some antecedents to beat. Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being together with us. So I'll start straight away. Reign of Edward VII, Queen Victoria's failure of a son. That's how she was seen. That's how he was seen, certainly by the royal couple, and of course later by his widowed mother. That he would never amount to anything. That he was in modern terms, a loser, defiant, willful, didn't listen to advice. And it all probably dates back, a psychologist or a psychiatrist would say, that it probably dated from even before he was born, because she conceived him when she was only just getting over the birth of the Princess Royal, the firstborn princess, known as Vicky, Princess Victoria. The Queen had already expressed her utter disdain and dislike for childbirth. She thought it was really horrible and disgusting, and actually said later to this daughter that she thought it was like being an animal, like a dog, like an animal at such times. She made no secret of the fact that she thought childbirth, the Almighty should have arranged it somewhat differently. It was totally horrible. So imagine how she felt when she realised that she'd caught with another baby only 8 weeks or so after giving birth, that she got to go through it all again. And she also had a more difficult time, which is unusual with the second baby. She had a more difficult labour. So the poor child was sort of at a disadvantage right from the word go, even before the word go, when she first realised she was pregnant again. The difficulty that they experienced as a young couple was that they had this heavy pressure, this heavy burden placed upon them of bringing up the next king. And they both had slightly unusual childhoods. Queen Victoria in particular didn't understand about children at all, because she hadn't had any brothers or sisters. She'd had a half sister and a half brother who were much older than she was, because her mother was a widow when she remarried. And as a result, Albert and Victoria made a lot of mistakes in upbringing, certainly in bringing up their first children, their first brood. Prince Albert was more sympathetic. He understood children more than Queen Victoria, who was a bit hopeless to. And in her own admission, she didn't really like children that much. She couldn't tune in to where they were coming from. She just wanted them to be grown up. She thought they were sweet when they were quiet and just decorative.
Pretty. But
yeah, pretty. But if they proved to have personalities of their own, then no, she didn't like that at all. They were as they grew up and they were defying her, or she saw it as defiance. They were just proving to have personalities of their own, but she didn't want that. She wanted them to just do exactly as they were told. Prince Albert, on the other hand, wanted a clone of himself. He wasn't imaginative enough to realise that children are all different, and that children don't necessarily follow on in their parents' footsteps. They don't necessarily inherit their parents' personalities and characters. And he seemed to think, Prince Albert seemed to think, that because the second child was a son, that the aforesaid son would be just like him. He would be an intellectual. He would love learning. He would love reading. He would have a wide range of interests. He would be eager for more knowledge. All these things true of Prince Albert, a seeker after knowledge, and very bright. We have no doubt. Very bright, very determined, very conscientious, never walked away from anything until it was finished. And he thought that Bertie, they called him, because he was called Albert Edward. Edward was his second name. Bertie would have somehow inherited these characteristics and virtues. And it turned out that Albert was a true Hanoverian. He'd inherited his personality from his mother. And so
she was the right thing.
Poor Prince Albert was really trying to row against the tide. He'd undertaken a hopeless mission, but he didn't understand that. He just thought that if he made his son work harder, if he disciplined him more, or it would all come right, and Bertie would suddenly become an intellectual. He would suddenly become much more intelligent, and he would stop having tantrums. He would stop throwing things around when something didn't suit him. Usually his tutors were telling him to do something and he either couldn't or didn't want to. And by the age of 7, he was a very, very willful, difficult pupil, snapping pencils in half, throwing books against the wall. Interestingly, we would say today, modern psychiatrists would pick up on this straight away, or a child psychologist, banging his head on the wall, which is a sign of absolute frustration. And children haven't got many ways of expressing frustration. If they're seated at a desk with an adult towering over them, and he would just suddenly get up and literally bang his head against the wall, as though he was suffering from overload in all respects. The tutor, he knew the tutor had to report every single day had to report to the royal family, particularly to Albert. Imagine that. Imagine being at school and having a report every day the parents would read. An angry father. But that's what happened. And Bertie failed every expectation. Had the temper tantrums. Albert didn't understand that. Albert, on the whole, was a calm and very, calm, controlled, and intellectual. If there was a problem, he worked it out intellectually. He didn't seem to have a bad temper. He would become irritable. Queen Victoria often said later in their marriage that he was irritable, but he didn't lose his temper. And so this child having temper tantrums and banging his head against the wall when he was 7 years old and should have grown out of tantrums, appalled both the parents. They just didn't understand why this was happening. He must be beaten. He must be punished. He must learn to conform. They had no idea why he was behaving like this, but we understand. We understand only too well that they were forcing the poor child, trying to force him into a mold for which he was absolutely unfitted. And the more Prince Albert tried to force his child to conform to an impossible standard, the more said child had tantrums, and it led to unhappiness all round. Other people, Lady Littleton, who'd been appointed governess to the older children, she always saw Bertie as a sweet little boy he was her favorite. He never had tantrums with her because she had come from a loving family. She got children of her own. She understood children, and he was totally different with her. And she was trying to teach. She was trying to teach him things about behavior and society and so on. And she did it gently and with understanding. And he didn't have any of these tantrums or outbursts of bad behavior. Very charming, she said, very polite. The child was a joy. She said that on one occasion. Sensitive and caring and affectionate and good with people. Now, Prince Albert was not good with people at all. Neither was Queen Victoria. So they didn't see this as a virtue at all. It was no kind of compensation to them to be told that their child was good with people. They just thought, well, that's frivolous. That's superficial. So what? We want him to be good with books. So you can see how there's a total mismatch between this child and his parents. And of course, when he was older, the aspects of his nature that his character being good with people came to the fore as something excellent. But the fact that he had been so restricted when he was young did come out in the ways that the royal couple had dreaded. They sort of predicted that he would go bad ways, and that's exactly what he appeared to have done. Pleasure loving, he was restless, he was very easily bored. He loved women, he loved gambling, all the things they despised and hated. He loved horse racing. Prince Albert and Queen Victoria disliked horse racing because it led to gambling, and gambling was a dreadful, wicked sin as far as they were concerned. Bertie loved the races when he was old enough to please himself. Went to the races and gambled on card games. He was a gambler. He loved hunting and shooting. Theatre going. The royal family didn't really go to the theatre very often. Smoking, absolutely a terrible sin. Queen Victoria absolutely hated anybody that hated smoking. The princes had to smoke, had to go into a room where there was a big obviously there was a big fireplace in all the rooms, and stand in the fireplace, smoke up the chimney so that she wouldn't smell the smoke. She was obsessive about smoking. So you can imagine how thrilled the royal family were when their son took to smoking. Cigarettes, cigars, not a pipe. They hadn't really come in at that time for respectable people. Loved his food, loved his drink. Never got totally drunk, but like fine wine. All the things his parents despised, he loved. A life of enjoyment and indulgence. And Martin found some great pictures, including a naughty chair. A very naughty chair. Called a love chair. That's a sort of polite way of putting it. I'm still not quite sure, and I don't really want to know because I'm very innocent. I don't really want to know how the chair worked.
And I'm certainly too prudish to tell you.
Well, yes, I should hope so. Martin said he's too prudish to tell me. But I remember seeing an illustration many, many years ago of the original. This is a copy of the original in a book about architecture and design, but the book about design actually. And it was suggesting in different ways, saying, what do you think this chair is? And somebody said, is it a dentist chair? And somebody else saying, is it a chair for having operations, holding somebody, put ropes around it and fasten somebody down while they're having an operation if they can't lie down. There are all sorts of suggestions as to what this chair might be used for, but not its actual purpose. So it is thought to have believed to have been in the ownership of Bertie and called a love chair. That's sort of a nice way of putting it. he married young by our standards anyway, by our culture today. We don't think getting married at 17, 18 is a good idea. He was a little bit older than that, but Princess Alexandra wasn't. I've mentioned already that they trawled Europe for a suitable partner for him. She'd got to be very special. Hopefully she would transform him. You know, the love of a good woman, he would be completely changed. He would start towing the line, he would become more like Albert, and there were great hopes resting on Princess Alexandra, who was only 17 when the marriage was arranged. A Danish princess. She'd been brought up very simply. The royal family loved that. They thought that was a great asset, that she'd been brought up simply. They brought their children up simply. That she was very innocent and virginal. Obviously, that was very important. But by the time they were discussing his marriage, Bertie had erred and strayed from God's ways like a lost sheep. And he'd had this tumultuous affair with Nellie Cliveden, the actress, or that's a polite way of putting it, a sort of an amateur prostitute, really. And the royal family, as you know, were absolutely horrified. Princess Alexandra had already been identified as an ideal consort for the wayward, backward, he was saying, backward intellectually backward prince. Prince Albert died before the marriage could take place, but he had already given the seal of approval to this Danish princess. So they married. It was probably a love match on her side. Princess Alexandra appeared to have fallen in love with her husband. He didn't fall in love with her, found her acceptable, but he didn't fall in love with her. The Queen found that absolutely strange, because when Princess Alexandra came over to this country to be married, well, before she was actually engaged, they came over on a state visit with the idea that the Queen would have a look at Princess Alexandra and talk to her for a while and give her a bit of a once-over and decide whether or not she was suitable. And she said, oh, she's so beautiful. How can my son resist her? He should be all fire and flame when he sees her. And then they did see each other, and the Queen was really indignant that her son hadn't fallen immediately for this beautiful princess, just as she'd fallen in love with Albert, and absolutely, just looked at him and that was it. She couldn't understand why her son hadn't fallen madly in love with the princess. She was very detached from reality. Poor Queen Victoria. So the marriage took place, and they had a family, 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. Princess Alexandra had a tendency to give birth prematurely, and the firstborn was a son, but born prematurely, and never really caught up. He was a 7-month child, and he never seemed to catch up. But he died in his 20s, and therefore it was George V. It was the Duke of York that became the next king. So poor Bertie wasn't allowed, as we've said already, he wasn't allowed to see any state papers, because his mother, widowed by this time, did not trust him or his raffish friends. She decided that he was too stupid to keep quiet about state secrets, and that when it had a few glasses of wine, he would be indiscreet and he would be chatting away about things that were state secrets to his friends, and then they would go and tell other people. And she basically just didn't trust his judgment at all. So the poor young man wasn't allowed to have any kind of training for his future as king. And again, Martin found some lovely pictures of the coronation portraits, 1901. So the prince wasn't trained. He came to the throne aged 59, had a very long wait as Prince of Wales. And overnight, court life became lively again. People were so, I mean, they weren't happy that the Queen had died, but she literally did die at the end of an era. She died in 1901, so it's kind of significant. It was a new century, a new age, and things were going to be different, and they were different from the word go. The prince, now king, did all sorts of things to indicate that things were going to be different. The royal couple were very popular, and to everyone's astonishment, the new king turned out to be a lot more intelligent than people had imagined, and was particularly good, good with people and good at arranging foreign relationships, alliances, and became a real asset to the Foreign Office, particularly developing friendship with France, our ancient enemy. Yes, we'd fought the Crimean War on the same side as France, but that was quite an aberration. They were our ancient enemy. We didn't get on with the French. The prince, when Edward had been Prince of Wales, he had loved Paris particularly. He loved the atmosphere, the freedom, the theatres, the joie de vivre, the fact that the French seem to enjoy life and enjoy the good things of life. They like good food and they like good wine and they like going to the theatre and they liked all the exciting, the Folies Bergère. He famously went to the Folies Bergère. Luckily his mother didn't find out. I don't know what she'd have done. Probably would have been the Tower or something. So everything French was, he felt that it was compatible with the French way of life. And so when he visited Paris in 1903, there were hostile shouts from the crowd. And he won them over, literally by that one visit, he won them over. He won the French over and the Parisians. So it's a bit like being able to win the Londoners over. You know, they once you won the Parisians, virtually you'd won the country. He did that himself. He wasn't given a script. The Foreign Office didn't say, this is what you've got to say, which we suspect happens today when the Prime Minister's let loose. Because when our Prime Minister today is let loose and he hasn't got a script, he tends to say the wrong thing. Yes, yes, no script. So the Entente Cordiale of 1904 was a very important alliance. And later there was an alliance with Russia, which created a three-way friendship, which was sustained through to the First World War. And the new king, surprised his ministers. They openly admitted they weren't expecting much. In fact, not only were they not expecting much, they were dreading Edward becoming king because of the reputation that had been created. You could almost say it was fake news, that people had expected him to be a disaster, to be stupid, irresponsible, talking when he should, discussing things with the wrong people, all the things that his parents, they'd sort of set him up for failure. And lo and behold, he wasn't a failure at all. And he got on well with his ministers. That was a delight. He got on well with his secretaries. Also a delight. They'd had such problems with Queen Victoria, digging her toes in about practically everything and being awkward and refusing to sign things, and absolute joy. This new king not only understood things, read things quickly. He wasn't the slow learner that everybody had said he was. He was a joy to work with. So what I've done now, having sort of established his personality, the establishment of the welfare state, which was a lovely O-level question if it came up. as long as the students could remember all the things, but I mean, usually they could, and it was a lovely question. So when Edward became king, and interestingly, he abandoned the name Albert. You know, the Queen would have been absolutely horrified, but she died, so it didn't matter how horrified she would have been. He abandoned the almost sacred name Albert. He'd been Bertie all his life, and he became Edward VII. So that was a change. That was a dramatic indication that things were going to be different. New age, new name. So when he became king, it was a Conservative government. Lord Salisbury had retired, and he was succeeded by his nephew, Arthur Balfour, famous for being the only bachelor prime minister until Edward Heath. Most prime ministers were married men. Balfour's government did achieve some important reforms, but many caused disquiet, and people were offended or decided that they didn't like this particular reform. So I've given some examples. The 1902 Education Act, seen as a reform, it gave government support to Anglican and Roman Catholic schools, which of course offended the non-conformists, because they said, you know, where's our money? What's wrong with our schools? It also, the Land Purchase Act of 1903 helped Irish tenants. They were talking about Home Rule. They'd been talking about Home Rule for a very, very long time. It was an attempt to sort of pacify the Irish and keep them loyal so that they would remain in the United Kingdom, which it didn't work, but it was a very good reform. But that offended landlords as a class, and not just Irish, not just people who owned land in Ireland, but people in this country got nervous. Oh, you know, if you're helping tenants, perhaps it'll happen in this country, and we should start losing out financially, you know, being hit in the pocket. Then the government decided that because of the disturbed state of Europe, and the Kaiser was already causing problems, disquiet, there should be more money in the Chancellor of Exchequer must divert money to defence, and particularly the Royal Navy. Pacifist voters and socialists objected to this very strongly indeed. So the government had managed to offend rather important sections of society. So he resigned in December 1905. Lord Balfour wasn't in power for very long as Prime Minister because of a foreign scandal. We were fighting the Boer War, or we had been fighting the Boer War. It's been over for 3 years, and all sorts of awful things were kind of emerging about the behaviour of, well, not exactly British troops, but barbarism accusations, rather like the things that are going on now. And so he resigned, which people did in those days. They did the honourable thing and they resigned. So there was a general election, January 1906. The Liberals campaigned very vigorously. The Conservatives had been in power for a very long time, since the time of Gladstone, and seemed to be rather weary and careworn, and didn't campaign very vigorously. And there were these scandals hanging over them, foreign policy scandals, Boer War scandals, and the fact that they'd offended various sections of society. There was a massive landslide. And in those days, they didn't do any polling beforehand. So elections were really exciting because nobody knew what was going to happen. Well, what happened was one of the massive majorities of all time, historically, 143. Beggars believe, 143. The Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, a Scot, the first person to be given the official title of Prime Minister, always known as CB. Now, tragically, he'd had a wonderfully happy marriage. They had no children, but they were absolutely, he and his wife, absolutely devoted to one another. So much so that they were a byword for happy marriage. And his wife had died the previous year, and he was a broken man. Power came to him too late. But he had excellent ministers. He had an excellent cabinet. They had campaigned vigorously for welfare reforms, and as soon as they had this wonderful majority, they started straight away keeping their electoral promises. So reforms, which really were remarkable, a whole raft of reforms, one after the other, one after the other. 1906 Trade Disputes Act strengthened the power of trade unions. Controversial, but it didn't matter if you got a majority of 143. You can afford to offend quite a lot of people. So that was the first one. The 1906 Workman's Compensation Act, really important, helped men who were injured or disabled following an accident at work. Before that, if a machine went rogue and you were trapped and you could never work again, you know, if you tore an arm off, and some machines were capable of doing that, of course, that was it. You could probably never be a wage earner again or a breadwinner. Your family would be immediately sink into abject poverty. And it seems strange to us now that there was no compensation. Well, now there was. That was a wonderful reform. Then, instead of prison for young offenders, there had been a lot of campaigning about how awful it was to send a young person to prison where they were likely to learn the tricks of the trade. It wasn't going to reform them. It was probably going to, when they came out, they were probably going to be much worse than when they went in. 1907 Probation of Offenders Act, setting up, I didn't say that, setting up of Borstalls, which is a place in Kent where the first one was built. Supervision within the community, a really modern way of thinking. Keep these young people out of prison if at all possible. Try and help them. They've had bad backgrounds. They need help, not punishment. So that was a very enlightened piece of legislation. Then, as early as 1907, a proposal that the House of Lords should continue, but be deprived of all real legislative power. It would continue almost like a kind of a decorative role, part of our heritage, like a venerable old building. It might not be any use anymore, but you don't demolish it. It's beautiful and old and venerable, and it's part of our heritage. So that there was a proposal, even in 1907, that the House of Commons was where it all happened. That was where there was real democracy. The Lords in those days, there weren't any life lords, life peers. The Lords were there because they had land and a title. They'd inherited their land. They'd inherited their place in the House of Lords, and that was in the present way of thinking. The current way of thinking seemed wrong, but to many people, of course, it didn't seem wrong at all. Certainly not to the Lords. They were appalled at the idea that they were going to be, have all power taken off them. But that was something which became a huge issue, which I will deal with, in 1910, 1911. A massive issue, sort of like Brexit. So it's interesting that all those years earlier, it was being spoken about. And Campbell Bannerman retired before this extremely contentious proposal had been acted upon. So it re-emerged in 1910. Help for hungry, malnourished children. Now, the Boer War was key in this, recruitment for the Boer War. We don't have a standing army, unlike most countries in Europe and in the world. We don't have, and never have had, a standing army as such, except during the Civil War. So it was recruitment for the army. And obviously the recruits had to undergo a medical to see if they were able to march and do all the things necessary. They were healthy enough. And the doctors were appalled because a lot of the young men that went to the recruiting office, because were working class, as they were for the First World War. The recruiting officers were full of young lads from the working classes who wanted a bit of adventure and some better food. Really, they were doing it for sort of social reasons. They didn't think they'd get killed. Foreign adventure, just to get away from their crowded house, crowded cottage, low standard, hard, poor food. Well, when the doctors saw these young men stripped off and started to examine them physically, they were horrified at how puny they were, how stunted many of them were, how they didn't seem to have grown properly. And they got pigeon chests and deformities, even though they were only in their late teens, early 20s. And many of them had rickets. So you could see there was something wrong with their bone structure. Why? Because they'd been brought up with very little sunlight, so hardly any vitamin D, an appalling diet, hardly, no vitamins, no protein. And the doctors recorded this in horror as more and more of these young men turned up. You couldn't really see until they took their clothes off how ill-looking they were. And that became an issue. That became a bit of not a bit of a scandal, a lot of a scandal. What to do about this? Well, 1908, the School Meals Act. How enlightened was that? That would come out of the rates. That meant the rates would go up, but in a good cause, to give poor children from poor homes a meal. Some schools didn't give a very substantial meal, and they relied a lot on cocoa, but at least cocoa is made with milk. Well, should be milk in it. And cocoa had chocolate, and therefore that was seen as very, very good for children. And sometimes they were given soup, and sometimes they were given sandwiches. But it was better than what they would have had at home. They probably wouldn't have had anything at home. They were out without breakfast, and they probably wouldn't have had a very substantial evening meal, and they wouldn't have had lunch or dinner unless the school provided it. But now the school was providing. Schools were providing food, and that was an enormous step forward, together with school examinations, medical examinations, which I can remember my grandma talking about very indignantly when it was my mother and my auntie. My grandma didn't agree with this at all. It was an intrusion, but it revealed all sorts of problems like poor eyesight and deafness and other problems which wouldn't have been discovered otherwise. I mean, and then the school dental, there were dental inspections. An absolutely wonderful reform to catch problems before they developed into these shocking examples that the doctors had recorded for when they were recruiting examining recruits for the Boer War. They were hoping to prevent that. So that was, again, a very, very enlightened piece of legislation. And then again, a very, very thoughtful piece of legislation. The idea was that if a man, lost his job for whatever reason, and sackings were, there was no compensation for being sacked. If you were sacked, you got to get another job, because there was no welfare system at all, really, except going to the workhouse. If you reached rock bottom, you were separated from your family for the rest of time. You went to the workhouse. That was it. It prevented people from starving. We didn't have people dying in the streets, but that was harsh. If you couldn't cope, you reached rock bottom, then the workhouse for the whole family. And looking for work was an issue, that men walked for miles looking for work. Obviously, they were looking for adverts in windows, or they went to a factory, they looked to see if there was an advert asking for for hands, they were called, or operatives looking for hands. They were recruiting, but sometimes they were just going from door to door, asking if there was work. And as that happened, and a side effect of that was that their shoes wore out. And it sounds like quite a trivial thing, but it wasn't. And their clothes got shabbier. They were out in all weathers trying to find work, walking. And they padded their shoes out with cardboard. They couldn't afford to have them mended. Well, we say mended in Yorkshire. They couldn't afford to have them, the soles replaced. A tragic situation. And yet there were hard-hearted people saying, they're lazy, the working classes could find work if they looked for it. A hard-hearted, steely attitude of contempt for the working classes. No, they probably couldn't find work. They tried and tried. And then they just got physically worn out. They weren't eating properly. And they were walking, trying to find work, and sometimes collapsing and getting shabbier. And then, of course, it was more difficult for them to get work because they looked so untidy. And down at heel, this expression, down at heel, meant your heels had worn out. It's again an expression which means shabby looking. So this was a wonderful reform. The idea of building and opening labour exchanges where you would go to one place and jobs would be advertised and details would be given, and it was a sort of link between the people who wanted workers and the men who were looking for work. A really excellent idea and very successful, of course. And Martin, as he explained, knows all about labour exchanges.
43 and a half years.
Wow. Did you hear that? 43 and a half years. I found some lovely pictures of labour exchanges. Now, when I taught this, to be honest, I hadn't realised, I hadn't appreciated why they were such a great reform. But I understand now, with it, imagine having to just tramp around trying to find work because your family's going to starve otherwise, or end up in the workhouse. There were charities, in case you're thinking, well, this sounds very hard-hearted. There were charities, and if you were a regular church attender and took communion, some churches were very good in the sense of soup kitchens and, like we say today, food banks. But there are all sorts of hoops you had to jump through. You got to be really respectable, and you got to be a church attender, and the vicar had to sort of say you were all right, that you were there regularly, and then sort of give you a approval before you qualified. But now, well, it was just a wonderful reform. 1909 Trade Board Act. Boards who could set minimum wage criteria that were legally enforceable, called in those days a living wage. This was a very dramatic step forward, because in the past, when that had been brought up and suggested by socialists, there had been shrieks of horror from the ownership classes and the masters and the people who owned factories, etc. They loathed and hated trade unions, because trade unions, if they could get better wages for their workforce, then obviously the product became more expensive and not as competitive. So there were many people who absolutely hated trade unions with a passion. So this is very, well, it wasn't brave, because they got this whopping great majority of 143. They were able to go ahead with these very controversial reforms. Particularly, this reform applied to the sweated trades, which were a scandal, particularly applying to women. Widows, of course, had no alternative. If they didn't want to end up in the workhouse, then they had to find some work. And many people cashed in on this desperation. They gave the women work, and they paid them peanuts, absolute pittance. One of the most famous, of course, was making shirts. somebody wrote a very sad poem called The Song of the Shirt, about a woman who's almost starving, working by candlelight, knowing that she was going blind, having to work at night by candlelight in order to just sustain herself and pay her rent. Absolutely awful. Whole families involved in making, for example, Christmas decorations. That took on as Christmas, became more of a thing. So making soft toys, paid a very tiny amount for each one. So back to the old kind of cottage industry, but very, very poor pay.
My aunt used to make rosettes at home, the rosettes that were awarded at
Right.
cattle shows. And
did you hear that? Oh, you did hear, yeah, what Martin said. Yeah, that's the sort of thing, something, well, women's work, and sort of making something repetitive.
For peanuts.
For which you didn't need a qualification. But how evil to sort of exploit the desperation that these families were enduring, the desperate, we're living literally from hand to mouth, from one meal to the next.
And Christmas crackers.
Yes, Christmas crackers, and putting the little toys inside, and then be paid according to how many they'd made, all counted out, and no let up, no holiday time, no part-time or anything, just having to work relentlessly in order to keep body and soul together. So that piece of legislation, the 1909 Trade Board Act, helped that and opened people's minds to the idea that there was this awful exploitation going on, because it went on behind closed doors. Of course, these women were working in their own home, or their little garret, their single room usually. The 1911 Shops Act, again, very enlightened, improving the health and welfare of shop staff, established a weekly half-day holiday. It literally was half a day, maximum of 60 working hours, and washing facilities must be provided. Something, again, we just absolutely take for granted. You think, well, of course they should be able to get washed. That wasn't a given, or hadn't been, but now it was. These are really important reforms, because they go to the heart of a problem and deal with it. Not entirely deal with it, of course. This is the beginning of the welfare state. Very much helped by a dynamic Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George. Now, in the sixth form, we all had to take on a character, somebody from the syllabus, and do an extended essay. When I got given Lloyd George, there wasn't a single mention of Lloyd George being a naughty boy, having an eye for the ladies. Not a mention of that at all. I knew nothing of this until I studied him again at university. I was doing A-level, but it was A-level and O-level. No mention whatsoever of his, well, the Welsh Goat was one of his other nicknames. He was called the Welsh Wizard. He was also called the Welsh Goat, for obvious reasons. And I was just saying to Martin before this session that in the days, well, at Edwardian times, women had very long hat pins because the hats were enormous and full of decorations. Again, something that was done in sweated workshops or whole cottage industry. Artificial flowers and birds and all sorts of things on the hat. So you needed a very long hat pin to get through all that onto the hair to hold the hat in place. So long hat pins came in, and I would say to Martin that it's not very far in a taxi or a car from Westminster to Whitehall, or the other way around, from Whitehall to Westminster. But as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was entitled to a car. They were in their infancy, of course. And the secretaries, female secretaries, travelled with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and with all the cabinet ministers. And even in that short distance, David Lloyd George was sort of pouncing on these secretaries. So they had to wave these hat pins at him in a threatening manner to say, you do that again and I'm going to stab you with the hat pin. Beggars belief. I was absolutely amazed when I read this. I thought he was as pure as the driven snow. I got him high up on a pedestal, thinking what a wonderful man he was. And there was this sort of shadow side to Lloyd George that I knew nothing of. So it makes it more interesting. But I was absolutely shocked when I found out what he was really like. But back to Lloyd George, the good and the noble. He himself had come from a very poor background, and he understood economics. He understood what he was a good Chancellor of the Exchequer. Instead of relying on charities and the Christian church organisations, he believed that the government should intervene, that they should work on a kind of Robin Hood principle. The very rich should be taxed to help the very poor, that was only right and proper. It was only what a Christian country should do. It should go without that the legislation to ensure that should go through without argument. You know, what were people arguing about? They were arguing from selfish motives or ignorant motives. Why should we help the poor? Why can't they help themselves? Why can't they find work? They're lazy. That was the prevailing opinion of many, many people. They'd got closed minds. They'd never met anybody that was really poor. They didn't understand poverty. And they certainly didn't understand the causes of poverty. They just seemed to think, as people had done over the centuries, that it was something to do with irresponsibility and laziness, or having enormous families, or they spent all their time gambling, or they spent the money on smoking and drinking, and just totally irresponsible. And then you didn't need to think about them anymore. You'd written them off. It was their fault. So we're looking at a new age. We're looking at new ideas about society, and old ideas being vigorously challenged by Lloyd George and socialists. I mean, Lloyd George wasn't actually a socialist; he was a liberal, but socialists like Keir Hardie working to change established ideas and opinions and concepts and misapprehensions. Ignorance meaning, well, I don't know anybody really poor, but I've heard that they're lazy. Not trying to find out any more about it, just that kind of an accepted opinion, it's called, where you just listen to what other people say. Challenging laissez-faire concepts, Victorian concept of laissez-faire. Leave it alone, it'll sort itself out. Lloyd George and many, many other people profoundly believed that the poor should be helped by government revenue. Where would the government get the money from? They would get it by taxing very rich people, incredibly rich people, people who owned enormous swathes of land, like the Nevilles and the Percys in the northeast, you know, sort of vast acres, and taking the rents from all those farms. You know, they'd never had to do a day's work in their life, not real work. They never had to do any kind of work. It was actually Joseph Chamberlain, who was a conservative, who said they toil in a famous speech about the House of Lords. They toil not, neither do they spin. Direct quote from the Bible. They toil not, neither do they spin. Very dramatic. They don't work. Other people have to work incredibly long hours, from dawn to dusk, just working to get a meal for that day. Some people don't have to work at all. So Lord George had been born into poverty, so he could speak from experience of being hungry and cold. So one of the steps forward was the 1908 Pension Act, old age pensions. Already established in Germany. Germany, people don't like knowing this, but Germany was ahead of us, way ahead. Bismarck, for all his faults, had established a welfare state in Germany. We like to think, or we still like to think, that we're ahead of other countries in terms of civilization and good, you know, a good way of living, a good, let's say, Christian way of living. Not so. Other countries were ahead of us, Germany in particular, and the United States in many aspects. Certainly in education, United States way, way ahead of us. So helping the old to stay out of the dreaded workhouse. What an awful thing to have worked all your life and then end in a workhouse in your old age, extreme old age, or just when you couldn't work anymore, because people didn't have a retirement age. They just worked and worked until one person said they worked until they dropped. They died in harness. So old age pension, brilliant. People over 70, indigenous people over 70 could apply for 5 shillings a week, which sounds ridiculous now, but 5 shillings would buy a lot of food. The full amount was paid to those with incomes below £21 per annum, reduced on a sliding scale for those between £21 and £31. And then it was the first United Kingdom pension financed from central taxation. And it was a kind of a Robin Hood act. It was going to pay the poor out of the income, central taxation taken from the rich and the well-to-do, the very well off, the very, very rich, and the middle classes. So imagine there was a lot of controversy about it. It was a very contentious subject because a lot of people said, this is the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of civilization end of civilization as we know it. They're doing it by stealth, little by little. We've got to say no to all this legislation because we can see where this is going. It's going to end up with the rich being taxed into extinction and the poor sort of laughing all the way to the bank, getting lazier and more irresponsible. We can see which way this is going. We've got to say no to all of this, because it's going to spread like an illness. 1911 Insurance Act, a contributory scheme, very, very, very controversial. Only covered payout for 26 weeks of government input. Now, I haven't expanded on that because I'm going to leave that. That was very, very controversial. I'm going to leave that till next time. Sort of going into the detail of that, because that was really was the beginning of the welfare state. So now the influences on Lloyd George, apart from the fact he can speak from experience, from his own poverty, his own poor childhood, he and his fellow liberals were influenced by 2 very famous investigations into the lives of the poor. Get the facts. That was the new idea. Get hold of the facts instead of all these misapprehensions and these assumptions that people make through ignorance. Let's find out what the working classes say about their situation. Let's have some facts. So one was by Charles Booth, and they weren't actually government inspired like investigations today. Or what happens today is often a university that goes in for this sort of investigation, this as a research project, because now subjects like sociology are offered and psychology are offered as university degree subjects, and they need a research topic. And so students are asked to investigate, and then the university sort of takes it on, and then they will publish their results. So no government can say we didn't know, because there's an enormous amount of information now available for all sorts of situations. Like just this morning on Radio 4, talking about the effect of the lockdown on some children, how backward, well, not backward, how much they've suffered, and how they're not developing as they should in all sorts of ways, and that's out in the open with proof, with evidence. So the influences on Lloyd George, these are not government investigations, these were independent men of independent means just wanting to know the truth. So Charles Booth was a rich ship owner, a Unitarian philanthropist, that was his motivation. He was a Christian, and a reformer. And he did a huge investigation into the London poor. And he came up with drew many conclusions from his investigation. He defined poverty as being a state when a person's resources are not sufficient to meet their minimum needs. And he also declared that poverty was owing to negative circumstances, not to the weak, lazy nature of the victim. Then presented the argument that poverty was trying to live on less than 21 shillings a week, pay week. Sorry, I hadn't corrected that. That's, yeah, it means below a certain standard, 21 shillings, it means per annum. I put week, that's my fault. So Martin's just written what I'd written, so I made him say that it's 21 shillings a year. You can't live on that. He proved that you can't live on that much or that little. The next very famous, possibly more famous because it was up north, Seaborn Rowntree, of the famous Rowntree family, the chocolate family, was an industrialist, a social reformer, and a Quaker. So again, non-conformist, and that was the motivation. And he claimed, again, fitting in with what Charles Booth had already found out and declared. So his research gave, his report or his book was called Poverty, a Study of Town Life. And he claimed that, controversial thing to say, people could not help being poor, which went against the teaching of the time. The Victorian teaching was, yes, people can help being poor, of course they can. They shouldn't drink, they shouldn't smoke, they shouldn't go to the pub, they shouldn't have they should leave marriage till later, they shouldn't have so many children, they should go and look for work, there's plenty of work around. Just blaming the victim. Very easy to do, blaming the victim. He said people could not help being poor. And large families caused poverty, not always. He went along with that argument that obviously the more children you have to feed, the less food there was for each child, and therefore that was a cause of poverty. But he didn't say it in a blaming kind of way. And he showed that 27.8% of the population of York lived below the poverty line, and that 9.91% lived in desperate poverty, almost starving. And he and Booth agreed that the main causes of poverty, the main causes were illnesses. Falling on hard times wasn't the fault of the person who'd fallen on hard times. It was usually because of an accident, although that had been dealt with. Illness of the main wage earner, the breadwinner. Illness, not anybody's fault. So these two men, and Martin's found pictures of very nice photographs of both of them, and a lovely picture of the National Health Insurance Bill. It's a punch cartoon, but of course they weren't cartoons to make people laugh. They were comments on political life. The Dawn of Hope, lovely heading, National Insurance Against Sickness and Disablement. We would say disability. Lloyd George sitting at the bedside of somebody, and he's looking at this. It's written sort of on the wall. Lovely. National Insurance Against Sickness and Disablement. The Dawn of Hope. So these were very influential findings. Charles Booth and Seaborn Rowntree. What we now say, we're investigative social workers or sociologists. They were trying to find the absolute truth by interviewing and going into people's homes and looking at the poverty that they were enduring and asking questions. You know, how long has it been like this? Did you ever have a well-paid job, what happened to it, and getting down to, we say, down to brass tacks, finding out the truth and not blaming people. And surprisingly, in view of what his reputation, ministers found the king to be very sympathetic. That was a most wonderful surprise. The king was sympathetic, unlike his mother, who Queen Victoria could sympathize when she was told about an individual family's problems, but not enormously sympathetic, it has to be said, because she'd been influenced by her first prime minister when she was only 18 and until she was 20, still very susceptible to influence, Lord Melbourne, who didn't have much time for the poor, just said, well, you know, even our Lord said, the poor are always with us. What can you do? You know, they'll always be there. I don't worry about them. I don't think about them. I don't like thinking about unpleasant things. He said that several times in different words. I don't like thinking about unpleasant things, which is not quite what you expect the prime ministers to say. I don't like thinking about unpleasant things. Although maybe we've got a prime minister now who works on in the same way, just puts things out of his mind. But Lord Melbourne had been quite a powerful influence on the Queen, more or less saying, what can you do? You know, what can you do about this huge problem? They're poor. Well, you know, almost like, so what? What can you do? Nothing. And he did say on one occasion, it's better not to interfere. Interference always makes things worse. Which he meant to be kind of funny, you know, it's a sort of cynical, funny thing to say, and the Queen probably took it seriously. So this was a delightful surprise that the king, who'd been brought up as a prince without any insight into anything, apparently, you know, just a playboy, had a deep understanding, because in his later years as Prince of Wales, he had interested himself in the working poor. Not so much the non-working poor, but the working poor, and he'd done quite a lot to improve the quality of working class housing, particularly in London, but not just in London. And he'd been the chairman of various committees, which people didn't sort of know about. They didn't realise that he had been working behind the scenes as much as he was allowed to during his mother's life. So doctors, so that was a great thing. That was a great surprise for the Liberal government, that the king himself had some liberal ideas. That was great. And doctors continued to express concern about the deteriorating state of health among slum dwellers. So back to this, these medicals that had taken place when they were recruiting for the Boer War, that had triggered a great deal of disquiet and concern. And so doctors were now saying, you know, we're bringing up a whole generation of weaklings. They are physically, we describe them as weaklings. And other countries have got a health service, and we're going to be left behind. These are the influences on the government. We're going to be left behind in terms of productivity and progress. Plus, it was discovered by the Board of Trade, who did do a lot of investigating and analysing the trade figures, that we were no longer top dog in terms of world trade. We were being caught up and overtaken by 3 countries: Germany, France, United States. That came as a shock. We've been riding high since the 1850s. Then we've got the, you know, more production, more. We'd invented machines, we'd invented locomotives, steam locomotives. We were exporting our ideas all over the world. We got the biggest empire ever known. We were riding very high indeed. So it was a bit of a shock to discover that other countries hadn't just caught up, they'd overtaken.
Even the French.
Even the French, what it said, even the French. Yes, even the French. So they had more advanced welfare systems. Where were we? Just beginning. just beginning to have a welfare system, playing catch up. Socialist ideas, another influence on the government, socialist ideas were gaining in popularity. Socialists using very persuasive arguments. They weren't, I mean, originally they were seen as madmen, mad people, and sort of undermining the constitution of which we were so proud. You know, that they weren't democratic. They were going to take over the country by using violent means and take over the government by coup d'etat. That was no longer true. There were many, many fine, very, very highly educated people who had become dedicated socialists, and who used very persuasive arguments and didn't say we're going to take over the government by force, or we're going to kill the king and set up a republic. Very reasoned indeed, and very persuasive, talking about fairness and decency and equality and justice as aspects of, well, civilization that we should be promoting. If we thought we were top country and we were the best at everything, then we should be promoting fairness, decency, equality, and justice. So there were these influences, very powerful influences on the government. And if you put them all together, the fact that they've got this dynamic Chancellor of the Exchequer, then, and the new Prime Minister was Asquith, who wasn't as dynamic as Lloyd George, but gave him, more or less gave Lloyd George his head, more or less gave him the freedom to follow through. So when we come back after Easter, if I'm sort of still in one piece, we'll look at the second half of this very exciting Liberal government in power, and up to the First World War, because there's some very, very controversial issues coming up. Reform of the People's Budget, which you've probably heard of, the 1909 People's Budget, which was the Robin Hood budget, tax the rich to pay for the poor. Very controversial indeed. And then, even more controversial, limiting the power of the House of Lords. Massive, massive fight, as you can imagine. 1910, 1911. The king died in the middle of this controversy, and poor George V, our Queen's grandfather, inherited this awful issue which dominated politics. Nothing else was happening. Got to get this sorted. How much power should the House of Lords have? Still current today, still an issue. So thank you very much indeed for listening. And I'm going into hospital, all being well, if I don't get COVID and the surgeon doesn't get COVID, going in on Thursday for my back surgery. So hopefully I'm going to sort of be bouncing around all happy and cured. And I hope you have a very happy Easter and a healthy Easter. I hope you stay free of COVID. And see you after Easter. I look forward
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Bye.
All the